2 hours of Simpsons lore to fall asleep to. Homer at the bat. The baseball episode everyone remembers. It began, as so many things do, in a kind of hush. Springfield at night was never fully quiet, but the stillness that lingered between the sounds carried its own rhythm. The distant whistle of a train, the slow hum of street lamps, the muffled bark of a dog somewhere down the block. These were the lullabies of the town. In that hushed cradle of sound, stories like this one seemed to grow, drifting between memory and dream. The town itself had a way of looking older at night, as if the shadows revealed a truer age. Wooden porches sagged more deeply, paint peeled with greater honesty, and even the stars above seemed less like sparks of light and more like quiet witnesses. Springfield was ordinary, everyone said, and yet, for those who lingered with it long enough, it was strange too, a place where small lives contained entire universes. Somewhere in that night sat Homer. Not the Homer of slapstick or laughter, but a man still figuring out how to carry his own weight, still reaching for something he could not quite name. The air was thick with summer. A baseball rolled across the cracked sidewalk, nudged along by nothing more than the breeze. It was a small thing, unremarkable to anyone passing by, and yet in that slow roll there was a sense of destiny. Stories often begin loudly with fanfare or thunder, but not this one. This one began in small breaths, with the ordinary, with the overlooked, with the kind of moment most people would forget by morning. But stories like this are not built from thunder. They are built from whispers. When Homer was a boy, nights like this were his favorite. He would lie awake, his window open, and listen to the faint sounds of baseball games drifting from radios in neighboring houses. He did not know all the rules, he could not always follow the commentary, but he understood the rhythm. He felt the joy in the crowd's roar, the sadness in the silences, the way hope could be measured in the pause between a pitch and a swing. It was not just a game to him then, it was a feeling, a promise that something small could matter. Even as a grown man, that promise lingered. He was clumsy, yes, and tired more often than not. Life at the power plant dulled the edges of his spirit, turning days into routines. But somewhere inside him lived that boy who listened at the window, and sometimes when the night grew soft enough, that boy stirred again, remembering what it was like to feel that promise of belonging. Springfield itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with him. The houses were not just houses, but sleeping companions. The streets were not just streets, but quiet rivers guiding memories downstream. Even the flickering lights above Moe's Tavern seemed less like neon and more like a lantern left burning in some eternal dusk. All around him, the town held its own stories, each folded gently into the next. And yet there was something different about this night. It carried a kind of expectancy, though not an urgent one. Not like the breathless suspense of a cliffhanger, but the calm weight of knowing something was about to bloom, like the hush before a lullaby begins. The baseball rolled once more across the sidewalk and came to rest at the base of a street lamp. It was ordinary. It was everything. What would follow was not war, not tragedy, not even what most would call greatness. It was simpler than that, and somehow more profound. It was the story of a man and a team, a town and its laughter, and the way even silly games can etch themselves into memory like scripture. It was the story of Homer at the bat, though for now it was just a whisper carried on the night breeze. The sky deepened into velvet. Stars scattered themselves lazily, and the moon leaned down like an old friend, its light pooling gently on the rooftops. Somewhere, a car rumbled by and faded into Intis, and still, Springfield breathed. Homer shifted in his chair, the wood creaking beneath him. He scratched absent-mindedly at his chin and let his eyes wander toward the bat propped in the corner. An old bat, nothing special. The kind of thing that could have been left behind at a schoolyard or forgotten in the garage for years, but for Homer, it held something more. It was carved long ago in a moment of longing he had nearly forgotten. To him, it wasn't just wood. It was a fragment of belief. Belief is a strange thing. It doesn't always arrive in flashes of certainty. Sometimes it is quiet, almost hidden. It lingers in old objects, in memories half faded, in the way a man looks at something and remembers who he used to be. Homer didn't think of it as belief, not consciously, but when he looked at that bat, some part of him still remembered being that boy at the window. The night lingered on, unhurried. Dreams were already beginning to settle over Springfield, one house at a time. Somewhere, a child turned in bed, clutching a toy. Somewhere else, a lonely man finished his last drink and stared at the clock. Somewhere the hum of the power plant continued, its machines indifferent to human longing. But in that quiet tapestry, a single thread was about to glow just a little brighter. Homer closed his eyes for a moment, letting the summer air brush against him. He thought vaguely of the game tomorrow, of his co-workers and their laughter, of the strange mixture of dread and hope that came with joining a team. He was not a man who always understood his own feelings, but tonight he did not need to. Tonight it was enough to simply sit, to breathe, to feel the weight of the bat nearby. The baseball still rested by the street lamp, a small circle of light gathering around it. A passerby might have ignored it entirely, but in the quiet logic of stories, it was no longer just a ball. It was a beginning. And so, without fanfare, without applause, this is where the story begins. In the hush of Springfield's night, in the roll of a ball, in the memory of a boy who listened, and in the quiet heart of a man, still reaching, it begins softly, as all lasting things do. Before the man with the bat, there was a boy with a window, a boy with ears pressed against the night, listening to a game he could not see. That was Homer, long before the weight of adulthood, long before workdays blurred into sameness. He was just a boy, small and round-cheeked, lying on his narrow bed with the covers half kicked away, listening for something that made him feel less alone. The house he grew up in was not large and not filled with riches, but it had its own kind of warmth. The kitchen always smelled faintly of bread or onions, depending on the day, and the old refrigerator hummed steadily like a friendly ghost. There was the sound of his father's slippers shuffling on the linoleum, the sharp clink of his mother's sewing needles, the quiet sighs of a home that had seen both love and worry in equal measure. And then, beyond all that, came the voices from other houses. The games played late into the evening, drifting across the neighborhood like a secret language. Radios were everywhere in those years, each one tuned slightly differently, so the sounds would arrive out of step, layered upon one another. Sometimes the voices overlapped, and sometimes the cheering rose like a sudden wave, startling Homer with its urgency. He didn't always know the score, but he knew the feeling. He felt it sink into him, soft but undeniable. It was not about the ball itself, nor even the players. It was about connection, about how people who might have nothing else in common could share one collective breath as a pitch was thrown. Homer would close his eyes and imagine the players moving across a glowing diamond under lights too bright to picture clearly. He imagined the crack of the bat, the slow arc of a ball cutting across the night sky, the rush of feet pounding dirt. It was a world larger than his own, and yet somehow it seemed to make his own world gentler. Children often fall asleep to stories. For Homer, baseball was the story. He didn't always understand the rules. When the announcer spoke of doubles or RBIs or balks, the words slipped past him like clouds, but he didn't need to understand. The rhythm itself was enough. The rise and fall of the crowd, the murmurs between pitches, the long silences broken by sudden roars, they became his lullaby. Sometimes he would whisper questions to himself. Why do they cheer like that? What does it mean? And though he never had clear answers, he felt that one day he would know. Childhood has a way of promising future clarity, as if every mystery will eventually unfold if you are simply patient enough. Homer waited with a child's quiet faith. There were nights when his father would glance into the room, see Homer awake, and frown. "Lights out, boy," his father would mutter, not unkindly but firmly, and Homer would close his eyes, feigning sleep, while keeping his ears wide open. He was not trying to disobey. He was simply trying to hold on to something he didn't yet have words for. That thin thread of sound tied him to a larger world. It made his small life feel less solitary. Sometimes he would dream about it. In those dreams, the players were not famous men in uniforms, but half-shadowed figures who carried both grace and strangeness. They were giants and ghosts, smiling and inscrutable, always turning toward him as if to say, "You belong here too." In the dream, Homer never held the bat quite right, and yet the ball always seemed to wait for him, hanging in the air a little longer, patient with his clumsiness. He carried those dreams quietly, never speaking of them to anyone. They became part of him, folded into his growing self like creases in paper. He was not a boy with many gifts, not quick at lessons, not nimble in games, but in his heart he carried the rhythm of those voices, and that rhythm became his compass. Children grow as they must, but the seeds planted in their earliest nights have a way of staying. For Homer, it was not the rules of the game that stayed, nor even the names of the players. It was the feeling of connection, that invisible string binding him to something beyond his own window. He would carry it into schoolyards where he tried to play, awkward and uncertain. He would swing late or trip over his own feet, and sometimes the other children laughed. But even then, he held on to the rhythm. He remembered the way the crowd's cheer on the radio had made him feel, not mocked, not small, but part of something vast. In his own clumsy way, he wanted to touch that feeling again. His first bat was not a bat at all. It was a branch he had pulled from the yard, worn smooth by his own hands. He carved at it with a kitchen knife, leaving uneven marks, a shape not quite right. But to Homer it was holy. It was his way of reaching across the distance, of holding in his hands the same thing that lived in the voices on the radio. He named it in his mind, though he never said the name aloud, and though the branch bat would splinter and break, he would keep the memory of it forever. Years later, when life had pressed heavier upon him, when days at the plant blurred into evenings of weary sighs, that memory still flickered. The boy at the window had not vanished. He was still there, waiting in the corners of Homer's heart. And though Homer could not have put it into words, he knew he was shaped by those nights of listening, shaped by the unseen games, the mysterious voices, the lullaby of crowds. Childhood does not always reveal its gifts in the moment. Sometimes, only when the years stretch long behind us, do we realize what stayed with us, what became the scaffolding for the rest of our lives. For Homer, the gift was simple, the rhythm of connection, the knowledge carried in his bones that even the most ordinary soul could belong to something larger. And so, before the bat, before the game that would one day be remembered, there was a boy who listened, who dreamed, who carved a crooked bat from a fallen branch, a boy who did not yet know what belonging meant, but who felt it pulsing softly in the cheers that drifted across the summer nights. In the hush of Springfield, those sounds faded into silence, and Homer, small and drowsy, finally let his eyes close, the rhythm still echoing within him. He drifted into sleep, the voices of the crowd still whispering like an unseen lullaby. Morning light has a different texture in Springfield. It does not pour through the windows in brilliance, nor scatter itself in dazzling streaks. Instead, it drifts like dust, soft and lazy, as though even the sun itself has learned to move at Springfield's pace. It fell across the floor of the nuclear power plant, dimming as it passed through smudged windows, settling at last on worn linoleum and tired shoes. For many, the plant was nothing but routine, a place of clipboards, switches, and the hum of machines too vast to ever be fully seen. Yet within those concrete walls, a strange kind of fellowship existed, Men and women who might never have spoken otherwise found themselves side by side, bound together not by greatness, but by the simple fact of showing up. They were not champions or legends, they were a team of oddballs. It was from this mismatched gathering that the Plants baseball team emerged, as casually as an idea murmured over lunch. A scribbled sign-up sheet, a half-hearted announcement, and then slowly names appeared. Lenny, with his thin smile and restless hands, Carl, steady as a stone, his laughter always arriving just a moment after everyone else's, Barney, whose heart was larger than his breath could carry, and Homer, who wrote his name in uneven letters, almost shyly, though he tried to make it look bold. There was nothing polished about them, no natural athletes, no graceful stars. Their gloves were mismatched, their uniforms ill-fitting, some borrowed, some dug out of closets where old moths had made their hoes. But when they first gathered on the field behind the plant, something about the sight carried its own quiet beauty. They were ordinary people, stepping, however briefly, into something larger than themselves. The field itself was rough. Grass grew too high along the edges. The bases were uneven, stitched together from whatever materials could be found. The outfield fence leaned at odd angles, like it had grown tired of its own duty, but in the way the morning sun struck the dirt, in the way the air carried a faint smell of cut grass and gasoline, the place seemed almost holy. The first practices were clumsy, filled with stumbles and laughter. Lenny threw with too much spin, and Carl swung too late. Barney tripped over his own shoelaces more than once, rolling into the grass with a groan that quickly turned into a chuckle. Homer tried to position himself with seriousness, gripping his bat too tightly, swinging with all the force of a man, trying to prove something to himself. The ball rarely went far, but his determination lingered in the air. What held them together was not skill, but spirit. They teased each other, yes, but always gently, as if they all knew they were in the same fragile boat. When Lenny dropped a pop fly, Barney clapped him on the shoulder and said, "It's just the sky playing tricks on you." When Homer missed a pitch so completely that he spun in a circle, Carl muttered, "That's style, man, pure style." And in the laughter that followed, something stronger than embarrassment began to grow. Each of them carried their own quiet burdens, as people always do. Lenny with his worries about never being taken seriously, Carl with his steady patience that sometimes hid a loneliness, Barney drifting in and out of sobriety, always chasing a feeling of belonging he feared would never last, and Homer, of course, carrying that secret rhythm from childhood, the memory of nights spent listening, the unspoken longing to matter. The game gave them a language for these feelings, though none of them would have named it that. On the field, they did not have to explain themselves. They simply played, each mistake folding into laughter, each success cheered with more joy than it seemed to deserve. They were, for those hours, not workers or misfits, but teammates. There was something oddly tender about their awkwardness. When Homer caught his first ground ball cleanly, the others clapped as though he had won a championship. When Barney managed to run all the way to second without stumbling, Carl lifted his cap in mock salute. Each moment was celebrated, not for its technical brilliance, but for what it meant. They were trying, and sometimes trying is enough. Even Mr. Burns, distant and severe in his office above, could not resist the faint amusement of their efforts. To him, they were pawns in a larger wager, though they did not yet know it, but to themselves they were something simpler, a patchwork family stitched together by dust, grass, and the uncertain flight of a baseball. Homer, more than the rest, carried the practices home with him. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, the bat resting across his knees, and think about the way it felt to stand at the plate, the weight of the wood in his hands, the silence before the pitch, the way his heart rose even when he missed. It was not about winning. It was about the chance to be seen, the chance to be part of something. In those moments, the boy with the window returned. The boy who listened, the boy who dreamed of connection, and now, as a man, he was beginning to live that dream, however clumsily. Springfield's nights continued their quiet rhythms. Radios still hummed, dogs still barked. But now, in the hearts of a handful of workers, something new stirred. A story was beginning to weave itself slowly and gently, like a thread pulled through fabric. Not a story of champions, but of oddballs. Not a story of triumph, but of belonging. And perhaps that is why this chapter matters most. Because long before legends stepped onto the field, before names and records were written, there was this, a handful of men in mismatched gloves, laughing at their mistakes, cheering each other on, carving out a fragile kind of joy in a tired town. The sun set softly over Springfield, painting the sky in muted oranges and purples. The field behind the plant grew dim, and the players wandered home, dust clinging to their shoes. They were not yet ready for greatness, but they were ready for each other, and that was enough. Morning light has a different texture in Springfield. It does not pour through the windows in brilliance nor scatter itself in dazzling streaks. Instead, it drifts like dust, soft and lazy, as though even the sun itself has learned to move at Springfield's pace. It fell across the floor of the nuclear power plant, dimming as it passed through smudged windows, settling at last on worn linoleum and tired shoes. For many, the plant was nothing but routine. A place of clipboard switches and the hum of machines too vast to ever be fully seen. Yet, within those concrete walls, a strange kind of fellowship existed. Men and women, who might never have spoken otherwise, found themselves side by side, bound together not by greatness, but by the simple fact of showing up. They were not champions or legends, they were a team of oddballs. It was from this mismatched gathering that the plant's baseball team emerged, as casually as an idea murmured over lunch. A scribbled sign-up sheet, a half-hearted announcement, and then, slowly, names appeared. Lenny, with his thin smile and restless hands. Carl, steady as a stone, his laughter always arriving just a moment after everyone else's. Barney, whose heart was larger than his breath could carry, and Homer, who wrote his name in uneven letters, almost shyly, though he tried to make it look bold. There was nothing polished about them, no natural athletes, no graceful stars. Their gloves were mismatched, their uniforms ill-fitting, some borrowed, some dug out of closets where old moths had made their homes. But when they first gathered on the field behind the plant, something about the sight carried its own quiet beauty. They were ordinary people, stepping, however briefly, into something larger than themselves. The field itself was rough. Grass grew too high along the edges, the bases were uneven, stitched together from whatever materials could be found. The outfield fence leaned at odd angles like it had grown tired of its own duty, but in the way the morning sun struck the dirt, in the way the air carried a faint smell of cut grass and gasoline, the place seemed almost holy. The first practices were clumsy, filled with stumbles and laughter. Lenny threw with too much spin, and Carl swung too late. Barney tripped over his own shoelaces more than once, rolling into the wreaths with a groan that quickly turned into a chuckle. Homer tried to position himself with seriousness, gripping his bat too tightly, swinging with all the force of a man trying to prove something to himself. The ball rarely went far, but his determination lingered in the air. What held them together was not skill, but spirit. They teased each other, yes, but always gently, as if they all knew they were in the same fragile boat. When Lenny dropped a pop fly, Barney clapped him on the shoulder and said, "It's just the sky playing tricks on you." When Homer missed a pitch so completely that he spun in a circle, Carl muttered, "That's style, man, pure style." And in the laughter that followed, something stronger than embarrassment began to grow. Each of them carried their own quiet burdens, as people always do. Lenny with his worries about never being taken seriously. Carl with his steady patience that sometimes hid a loneliness. Barney, drifting in and out of sobriety, always chasing a feeling of belonging he feared would never last. And Homer, of course, carrying that secret rhythm from childhood. The memory of nights spent listening, the unspoken longing to matter. The game gave them a language for these feelings, though none of them would have named it that. On the field, they did not have to explain themselves. They simply played, each mistake folding into laughter, each small success cheered with more joy than it seemed to deserve. They were, for those hours, not workers or misfits, but teammates. There was something oddly tender about their awkwardness. When Homer caught his first ground ball cleanly, the others clapped as though he had won a championship. When Barney managed to run all the way to second without stumbling, Carl lifted his cap in mock salute. Each moment was celebrated, not for its technical brilliance, but for what it meant. They were trying, and sometimes trying is enough. Even Mr. Burns, distant and severe in his office above, could not resist the faint amusement of their efforts. To him, they were pawns in a larger wager, though they did not yet know it, but to themselves, they were something simpler, a patchwork family stitched together by dust, grass, and the uncertain flight of a baseball. Homer, more than the rest, carried the practices home with him. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, the bat resting across his knees, and think about the way it felt to stand at the plate, the weight of the wood in his hands, the silence before the pitch, the way his heart rose, even when he missed. It was not about winning, it was about the chance to be seen, the chance to be part of something. In those moments, the boy with the window returned, the boy who listened, the boy who dreamed of connection, and now, as a man, he was beginning to live that dream. However clumsily, Springfield's nights continued their quiet rhythms. Radios still hummed, dogs still barked. But now, in the hearts of a handful of workers, something new stirred. A story was beginning to weave itself, slowly and gently, like a thread pulled through fabric. Not a story of champions, but of oddballs. Not a story of triumph, but of belonging. And perhaps that is why this chapter matters most. Because long before legends stepped onto the field, before names and records were written, there was this, a handful of men in mismatched gloves, laughing at their mistakes, cheering each other on, carving out a fragile kind of joy in a tired town. The sun set softly over Springfield, painting the sky in muted oranges and purples. The field behind the plant grew dim, and the players wandered home, dust clinging to their shoes. They were not yet ready greatness, but they were ready for each other, and that was enough. There are certain mornings when the air itself feels weighted, as though carrying a secret. Springfield knew such mornings well, when the usual hum of the town seemed to hide something underneath, waiting for the right ears to notice. On one such morning, the nuclear power plant bustled in its ordinary, weary rhythm, workers punching in, machines sighing their endless metallic breaths, the cafeteria already smelling of overcooked bacon. And yet, in the tall office above it all, something strange began to stir. Mr. Burns sat at his desk, long fingers steepled, eyes glinting not with joy but with the sharpness of old hunger. To most he was a figure of authority, brittle and distant, his words as cutting as the shadows he seemed to live in. But on this day he was not merely a boss, he was a man plotting a story, though he himself would not have named it that. What passed through his mind was not business as usual, but something older, stranger, the thrill of turning chance into destiny. Smithers hovered nearby, notebook in hand, trying not to sigh as his employer muttered about baseball. Baseball, that game of dirt and dust, of cheers and silence. It seemed far beneath the man who measured lives in kilowatts. Yet Mr. Burns leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as if he were peering into a vision only he could see. He spoke of wagers, of proving something not to the world but to himself. A team, his team, not because he loved the game, but because victory, even in play, was another form of power. Down below, the oddballs of the plant stretched stiff arms and swung at invisible balls during their lunch breaks. They had no idea they were being folded into a promise they had not made. To them, the coming games were laughter, a way to escape monotony, a reason to cheer one another on. They did not see the way Mr. Burns' plan was already knitting itself around them like a net. It would be easy to tell this as a tale of greed, an old man chasing pride, but greed is only the surface. Beneath it was something softer, stranger, for even in Mr. Burns' scheming, there was a kind of longing, a longing to command fate, to shape outcomes, to carve his initials into a story larger than himself. It is a longing many carry, though most never admit it, the desire to leave a mark that will outlast our days. The wager itself, whispered first to Smithers and then scribbled in trembling ink, carried the weight of a spell. It was not written in lore, nor sung in song, but it bound those who touched it all the same. The words spoke of recruiting outsiders, of filling the team with men whose names shimmered with renown. Stars, legends, men who seemed less like players and more like myths walking among mortals. If he could bring them to Springfield, if he could bend them into his game, then surely victory would be his. And yet, as with all strange promises, there was more hidden in the shadows. A wager is not only about winning, it is about what one is willing to risk. For Burns, it was reputation, pride, the brittle dignity he carried like a cane. For the workers, though they did not yet know, it would be something quieter, the fragile belief that their ordinary selves could be enough. That night, Springfield seemed unaware of what had been set in motion. Children still played in the streets until the lamps blinked awake. Moe's still poured its bitter comfort. The sky still scattered its stars with careless grace. But in the corners of the town, whispers seemed to linger a little longer, as though even the air knew that strangers might soon walk its streets. Homer sat on his porch again, the bat resting against his knee, and felt a restlessness he could not name. He swung it once, gently, into the summer air, and imagined himself in a game far larger than the dusty field behind the plant. He imagined crowds, though he could not see their faces. He imagined voices rising, though he could not make out their words. He imagined being seen, truly seen, even if just for a moment. He did not know as he swung that the shape of his longing was being woven into Mr. Burns' plan. He did not know that the bat he held, so ordinary in its chipped wood, would one day stand beside legends. He only knew that when he swung, the air seemed to answer him, softly, like a friend whispering. Not yet, but soon. The wager spread through the plant in fragments, carried in overheard conversations and knowing looks. Burns wants to stack the deck, someone muttered over coffee. Big names, real players. Laughter hod, the kind of laughter that tried to hide curiosity. The workers shrugged, rolled their eyes, went back to their machines, and yet each of them felt a small stirring. What would it mean to stand beside such names, to play if only for a moment, as equals? The oddballs kept practicing, clumsy as ever, but now the air around them carried a faint electricity. Lenny's throws felt a little sharper, Carl's swings a little bolder. Even Barney, stumbling as he ran, laughed louder, as though joy itself had grown heavier in his chest. And Homer, he could not say why, gripped his bat with more care, as though sensing the story's tide beginning to shift. Promises often begin invisibly. They are whispered in offices, scribbled in ink, muttered in dreams, but once spoken, they grow roots. They spread through lives, binding the unaware as tightly as those who cast them. That is what happened in Springfield. Mr. Burns made a wager, and though he believed it was his alone, it became everyone's. Night returned once more. The field behind the plant lay empty, the bases pale under moonlight. The grass swayed in a breeze too soft to feel. If you stood there long enough, you might have heard it, the faint echo of voices not yet arrived, the ghostly applause of games not yet played. The promise was already alive, pulsing quietly in the dark. And somewhere, in the silence of his own heart, Homer felt it too. He could not name it, he could not see it, but as he drifted towards sleep, the boy at the window stirred once more, whispering across the years. Something is coming, not thunder, not glory, something quieter, yet lasting. A strange promise, unfolding in the night. There are moments in a town's history that feel less like fact and more like folklore. People remember them not with precision, but with awe, as if the details matter less than the feeling they carried. For Springfield, one such moment arrived quietly, without fanfare, though it would later be remembered as if giants had walked its streets. The wager whispered into life by Mr. Burns did not remain bound to his office for long. Promises have a way of calling out, and soon the call was answered. Names that once belonged only to stadiums and highlight reels began to drift toward the quiet town. To the children who followed the sport, they were heroes made of flesh and legend. To the adults, they were reminders of something larger than the everyday, and to the oddballs of the power plant, they were omens of change. They did not all arrive at once. Instead, Springfield received them as the earth receives rain, in drops, scattered, each carrying its own shimmer. One morning a tall figure was seen stepping off a bus, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder as though it weighed nothing at all. Another day the station doors swung open to reveal a man whose smile seemed to draw light itself toward him. By the week's end, the town had more visitors than it could explain, yet no one seemed surprised. It was as if Springfield had always been waiting for them, though it had never dared to say so aloud. Each legend carried with him an aura, subtle but unmistakable. Wade Boggs, with the calm gaze of a man who had faced countless pitchers and knew patience as both weapon and shield. Roger Clemens, whose presence rumbled like thunder even when he said nothing at all. Ozzie Smith, who moved as though gravity bent itself to his will, walking with the grace of a secret dance. Don Mattingly, steady as oak, whose quiet strength felt like a promise. And others still, each bringing their own fragment of myth. To see them wander Springfield's modest streets was to witness something gently impossible. Children peeked from behind fences as the men passed, their eyes wide as if gazing upon titans. Old men at Moe's Tavern leaned closer to one another, swearing under their breath that the town had never seen such a sight. Yet, for all the awe, there was no frenzy. The legends did not arrive as celebrities but as travelers, moving softly, speaking kindly, as though they belonged not to the roar of stadiums but to the hush of small-town evenings. At the plant, the oddballs gathered during lunch breaks, trying not to stare when the visitors appeared among them. Homer clutched his bat a little tighter, his palms sweating not from the summer heat but from the quiet knowledge that he was standing near men who had carved their names into history. Lenny and Carl whispered nervously about how to greet them, while Barney tripped over his own feet in a clumsy attempt to impress. Yet the legends did not laugh. They smiled, nodded, joined the circle as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Practice changed. The clumsy swings, once met with shrugs, were now corrected with gentle hands. Roger adjusted a grip. Wade showed how to watch the ball rather than the air around it. Ozzie spun with effortless motion, reminding them that even the body could be taught to dream. And slowly, almost invisibly, the oddballs began to sharpen. Their throws found targets. Their swings met contact. Their laughter rang brighter, not because they had become perfect, but because they had been invited into a story greater than themselves. And yet, beneath the joy, there was unease. For the wager still lingered like a shadow. The men had not come merely to teach. They had come to play, to wear Springfield's name upon their jerseys, to chase a victory that was not theirs but Mr. Burns'. The townsfolk sensed it in the way the old man watched from the sidelines, his thin smile never quite reaching his eyes. To him, The legends were not guests, but pawns. To the workers, however, they were something more, living proof that ordinary lives could brush against greatness, if only for a season. Children filled the empty lots at dusk, imitating their new heroes with makeshift gloves and battered bats. The stars themselves, amused and softened, sometimes joined in. Ozzy taught cartwheels between bases, much to the children's delight. Mattingly helped a shy boy adjust his stance until he connected with a pitch for the very first time. And when the ball soared into the evening sky, the boys' laughter carried far enough that even those who did not see the moment felt it echo inside their chests. Not every visitor found the town gentle. Some stumbled into Moe's bar and left bewildered, wondering how such a place survived at all. Others grew restless with the plant's endless hum, but even in their frustrations, they seemed touched by Springfield's peculiar rhythm, a rhythm of imperfection and resilience, of laughter stitched into weariness. By the time night fell, even the restless ones would be found sitting quietly under the stars, listening to the crickets, letting the stillness of the place seep into their bones. For Homer, the days grew stranger still. He practiced until his arms ached, not out of duty but out of longing. He dreamed of standing among the legends, not as a spectator but as one of them, his bat echoing with the same music theirs did. At night, when sleep finally claimed him, he heard again the boy at the window whispering, "You are closer than you think." The town began to hold its breath, sensing that something was approaching. Games would be played, victories sought, pride tested, but beneath all of that, there was something gentler, harder to name, a weaving together of lives, a reminder that stories do not belong only to the great, but also to those who stand beside them. One evening, as the sun slipped low and painted the sky in amber, the legends and the locals gathered on the field behind the plant. There was no scoreboard, no cheering crowd, only the quiet of twilight and the sound of balls cracking against bats. For a brief moment, the line between myth and man vanished. They were simply players together, their shadows stretching long across the grass. And Springfield, watching from porches and windows, knew it was seeing something it would never forget. In the years to come, people would tell the story differently. Some would swear the stars had come to dominate, to crush the opposition. Others would say they came only to teach, to gift Springfield with fleeting grace. But those who were there would remember the truth. The legends came not to shine alone, but to share their light. And in doing so, they changed the town forever. The wager still waited, silent and sharp, but for now, Springfield rested in the glow of their presence. The night deepened, the field emptied, and the echoes of laughter lingered in the dark. The chapter had turned, and though no one could say what the next page held, they knew they were already inside a story that would outlast them. The evening came dressed in a hush, as though the sky itself knew that something rare was about to unfold. The field had never looked so carefully tended. The chalk lines gleamed pale against the soft grass. The bases, freshly anchored, seemed to wait with the patience of old stones. A faint breeze stirred the flags above, carrying with it the mingled scents of hot dogs, dust, and the faint sweetness of summer twilight. Springfield was not known for beauty, but that night the field glowed like a lantern in the dark. The workers filed in with their mismatched uniforms, nervous smiles tucked beneath their caps. They were no longer merely employees of the plant. Tonight, they were ball players, and though their skills were uneven, their hearts beat together like a drum. Alongside them, the legends stood, men who had traveled far, who had faced roaring stadiums and flashing cameras, and who now found themselves in this quiet corner of the world, lending their strength to a story they hadn't expected to join. Homer clutched his bat and exhaled, his chest rising and falling like the tide. He felt the weight of eyes upon him, not of judgment, but of expectation, the kind that asks gently, without demand. He remembered the boy at the window, the whisper that had haunted his dreams. "You are closer than you think." Perhaps, he thought, This was what closeness felt like, trembling at the edge of something vast, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. The crowd gathered in small clusters, families with picnic blankets, children with sticky hands, old men leaning on canes. They weren't there for spectacle, they were there for belonging, for the comfort of sitting side by side and sharing a night of wonder. Some whispered that Springfield would surely lose, others that maybe luck would carry them through. Yet beneath the chatter was a deeper current, unspoken but shared. Whatever happened tonight, they would remember it together. The umpire's voice broke the quiet. The first pitch was thrown. The game began not with triumph but with stumbles. A ground ball slipped between fingers. A swing cut only at air. Laughter rose from the stands, not cruel but kind, as though the town itself wished to cushion the blow of mistakes. And yet, with every error came a flicker of determination. Lenny dove again, harder this time. Carl steadied his hands, refusing to flinch. Barney, though swaying, managed a catch that drew cheers loud enough to startle the evening birds from the trees. Then the legends stepped in. Their motions were not sharp demonstrations of superiority, but gentle reminders of what was possible. Roger's pitch thundered, yet seemed to land softly in the catcher's glove, as though power had learned restraint. Wade's swing met the ball with a sound that carried like music across the field. Ozzie danced between bases with a grace that made even the skeptics smile. These were not men towering over Springfield, they were men weaving Springfield into their rhythm. For a time it felt less like a competition and more like a dream shared aloud. Homer stood in the dugout, watching his teammates glow in the presence of greatness. When his turn came, his hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the bat. He closed his eyes, drew a breath, and remembered that strange whisper. Then he stepped forward. The pitcher wound up. The ball sped toward him. Homer swung. The crack of contact echoed across the diamond. The ball did not soar into legend, but it did rise, a small arc of hope, climbing just high enough to fall safely between two outfielders. The crowd erupted, not for the size of the hit, but for the simple fact of it. Homer stood stunned at first, then shuffled awkwardly to first base, cheeks flushed with disbelief. And in that moment, Springfield cheered louder than it had in years. The innings passed like chapters of a lullaby. Some ended in quiet disappointment, others in bursts of applause. Children clapped until their palms reddened, while their parents smiled, warmed not by victory but by the sight of joy itself. The score mattered, of course, but it mattered less than the way the town leaned into one another, less than the way strangers found themselves speaking like old friends. By the middle of the game, even Mr. Burns, perched high in the stands with his calculating gaze, could not entirely resist the softness of the night. His lips curled in what might have been a smile, though it vanished almost as quickly as it came. To him, this was strategy, investment, leverage. To the others, it was communion. As the final inning approached, the air thickened with a strange stillness. The score was close, closer than anyone had expected. The legends continued to shine, but the oddballs had found a rhythm of their own, imperfect yet resilient. Every play was met with breathless gasps, every out with a collective sigh. Even the stars, seasoned as they were, felt the peculiar magic of it. This little town pressing itself into memory. Homer came to the plate one last time. The field hushed. He stood there, heavy and unsure, yet filled with something brighter than fear. The pitcher's arm moved, the ball spun. Homer swung, the bat missed. A groan rippled through the stands. Another pitch, another swing, a second miss. His knees trembled, the whispers in the crowd softened, not mockery, but encouragement, as if filling him to try just once more. The final pitch came. Time seemed to slow, the ball spinning through the dusk like a tiny moon. Homer swung with all the clumsy power he could gather. The crack was sharp, clean, undeniable. The ball shot forward, low and fast, skipping past the infielders before anyone could move. Homer lumbered toward first, the crowd's roar swelling like a tide. He reached safely, panting, his chest heaving, and in that moment Springfield felt not like underdogs but like dreamers who had touched the sky. The inning ended soon after. The final score was not etched in glory. Springfield did not win, yet when the players gathered, sweat on their brows and smiles on their lips, no one seemed to care. The field had been a cathedral that night, and they had all been worshippers of something greater than themselves, of effort, of laughter, of the fragile magic of trying together. The legends shook hands with the locals. Children clung to the memories already forming, and as the lights dimmed and the people drifted home, the town carried with it a new story to tell, one that would ripple across time like the gentle echo of a bat meeting a ball under a dusky sky. Springfield had played, Springfield had been seen, and in that quiet triumph the night ended, not with defeat, but with a promise that some games are never lost, so long as they are remembered. The glow of the first game lingered like candlelight after the flame had gone out. In the taverns, in the kitchens, in the quiet porches, where neighbors sat together, Springfield spoke of the night as it had been a miracle. Children replayed the moments in dusty lots, mimicking the swings of their new heroes. Even the weary men of the plant walked taller in the days that followed, their shoulders carrying something softer than pride, a sense of having belonged, if only for a few innings, to a story larger than their routine. But beneath the warmth, shadows stretched. Not everyone remembered the night as a gift. For Mr. Burns, the game was not about laughter or community, it was about victory. He had wagered, and in his mind, the town's joy was only useful if it fed his triumph. The legends he had summoned were not companions in a shared dream, but instruments, tools meant to secure his glory, and as the weeks crept on, his impatience grew sharp. In the stillness of his office high above the plant, Burns sat with his long fingers steepled, eyes glinting like cold lanterns. Smithers hovered nearby, voice gentle, suggesting patience, but the old man's muttering betrayed his thoughts. The workers were still on the roster, still cluttering the field with their clumsy swings and missed catches. Why leave such fragile pieces on the board when stronger ones had arrived? To Burns, loyalty meant nothing, only the wager mattered. And so quietly the wheels began to turn. Accidents were arranged with eerie convenience. A locker door falling heavily upon a shoulder, a stairwell slicked just enough for a tumble. A mysterious illness striking at odd hours. Each misfortune seemed harmless at first, the kind of bad luck Springfield was used to shrugging off. But as they accumulated, a pattern whispered itself into existence. One by one, the oddballs found themselves pulled away from the game they had only just begun to believe in. The town noticed. Lenny showed up one day with his arm in a sling, muttering that he must have slept wrong, though the bruise told another story. Carl missed practice with a fever that seemed too sudden, too exact. Barney arrived late, clothes torn, claiming he'd been caught in a strange accident with a falling sign that no one else had seen. The legends offered sympathy, but their eyes were wary, as though they recognized a kind of interference they had encountered before in other grander arenas. Homer, too, felt the unease, though he could not name it. He practiced alone in the evenings, swinging his bat beneath the fading sky, listening to the hush of crickets. Yet, each time he looked toward the plant, its looming silhouette against the twilight, he felt the whisper of something watching, something arranging. The boy at the window returned in his dreams, not smiling this time, but gazing with a sadness that carried warning. "Be careful," the boy murmured. "Some games are played for hearts, others are played for power." The legends tried to steady the mood. Wade offered calm words, reminding them that no game is without challenge. Ozzy filled practice with laughter, teaching cartwheels and flips to ease the tension. Clemens threw pitch after pitch with a thunder that seemed to dare the shadows to interfere. But even their presence could not erase the gnawing sense that someone was tugging at invisible strings. The townsfolk whispered too. In Moe's bar, theories swirled like smoke. Some swore Burns had cursed the team. Others insisted the oddballs were simply unlucky, doomed by their own clumsiness. Yet, underneath the gossip was a quieter truth. Springfield feared losing not the wager, but the fragile joy the team had given them. They had glimpsed themselves as something more than weary workers. To have that taken away would feel like waking from a dream too soon. The next game arrived, and Springfield's lineup was thinner. Legends filled more positions, their skill dazzling but their smiles strained. The oddballs who remained played harder than ever, desperate to prove that they belonged. Homer swung with all the weight of his longing, striking out twice but connecting once. Enough to draw a cheer that carried through the night. Yet even in the applause there was a hollowness. Too many familiar faces were missing from the field. Burns, watching from his high seat, tapped his fingers against the armrest, his expression unreadable. To him, the thinning roster was progress. Fewer liabilities, fewer risks. But to the town it was a wound. They loved the stars, yes, but it was the sight of their own, stumbling, sweating, trying, that had made the games feel like theirs. Without them, something essential was slipping away. Homer felt it most of all. Standing on the field, he glanced around and saw fewer friends beside him, fewer familiar voices calling his name. He still played, still tried, but each swing felt heavier, as if the bat carried not only the weight of wood, but the weight of absence. When he returned home at night, he sat in the kitchen, long after Marge and the children had gone to bed, staring at his calloused hands, wondering if dreams could be stolen as easily as they were given. And yet, even in the midst of shadows, Springfield held on. After each game, neighbors gathered to share food, to tell stories, to remind one another that belonging was not measured by victory but by presence. Children still played in the lots, even if their imitations grew tinged with confusion. The town clung to its dream, fragile as glass, unwilling to let it shatter entirely. The legends, too, began to shift. What had started as obligation grew into something deeper. They lingered longer after game, speaking with townsfolk, signing worn gloves, offering small kindnesses. It was as if they, too, felt the pull of Springfield's quiet heart, and did not want to see it broken by an old man's wager. But the shadows lengthened. Burns' hand had only just begun to reveal itself, and Springfield stood at the edge of a truth it was not ready to face. That the story unfolding on the field was not simply about baseball, or even about pride. It was about power, about the ease with which joy could be stolen, and about the courage it would take to hold on. As the chapter of that week closed, the town went to bed restless. The night air was heavy, the stars dimmed by unseen clouds, and in his sleep, Homer dreamed again of the boy at the window. Only this time, the boy was walking away, fading into the distance, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his warning. The days that followed carried with them a strange thinning, as though Springfield itself were being unstitched at the edges. What had once been a full roster of oddball workers now seemed to fade, one by one, into absence. Each departure was explained away, an injury here, a sickness there, an accident too uncanny to be believed yet too quiet to resist. The town noticed, of course. How could it not? But in Springfield, strangeness had always worn the mask of normalcy, and so the vanishings were spoken of in hushed tones, with shrugs that carried more fear than certainty. The field told the story most clearly. Where once the dugout buzzed with chatter and laughter, now it seemed spacious, echoing. Fewer uniforms lined the bench. Fewer familiar voices called encouragement across the diamond. The legends filled the empty spaces with grace, but their brilliance only made the absences starker. It was as though a painting had been altered, brighter colors painted over the soft, uneven strokes that had once given it soul. Lenny had vanished first, his arm still bound in its sling. He left quietly, without fanfare, and though he promised to return when he healed, weeks passed without his shadow reappearing on the field. Carl followed, taken by a fever that lingered without explanation. Mo, pressed reluctantly into service, found himself disqualified when his temper sparked too brightly one afternoon, and then Barney, who seemed the most loyal of them all, simply stopped arriving, muttering about bad luck before slipping back into the comfort of taverns. Homer watched it all with a helpless ache. Each time a friend disappeared from the lineup, he felt as though the field itself grew colder, more hollow. The legends were kind. They offered him guidance. They clapped his back. They treated him as though he belonged. Yet Homer's heart clung to the faces that were missing, the ordinary men who had once stumbled alongside him. Their flaws had been his mirror, their laughter his anchor. Without them, he felt exposed, standing at the edge of a story too large for him to fill alone. The townsfolk grumbled in their own way. Some spoke of curses, of Springfield's long history of accidents and oddities. Others whispered of Mr. Burns, their suspicions sharpening into something like certainty. They knew the old man too well to believe in coincidence. Yet what could they do? He was untouchable, sitting in his high office like a spider at the center of a web no one dared disturb. Still, hope clung stubbornly to the people. They gathered for every game, waving homemade signs, cheering loudly for every hit, every catch, every scrap of effort. They cheered not only for the legends, but for the fragments of their own that remained, and in those cheers lived defiance, a refusal to let the vanishings erase the dream entirely. Homer carried that defiance quietly. At night, when the house was still and the children had drifted into their own small dreams, he sat awake at the kitchen table, staring at the bat resting across his lap. He traced its grain with tired fingers, whispering words he could not quite name. Was it a prayer, a promise? He did not know. He only knew that he did not want to lose the story he had found himself inside. The boy at the window returned to him in dreams. This time, the boy's face was clearer, eyes bright but filled with sorrow. One by one, the boy whispered, "The game will hollow, but do not forget, even hollow shells can carry echoes. Even echoes can guide the heart." Homer woke with tears on his cheeks, though he did not understand why. The legends, too, began to sense the strangeness. They were men who had traveled, who had played in places touched by superstition and intrigue, and they recognized the fingerprints of interference, yet they said little, bound by loyalty to their host. Instead, they tried to fill the silence with kindness. Wade lingered after practice to teach Homer patience at the plate. Ozzie, ever playful, lifted spirits by tumbling in the grass until even the children laughed. Clemens threw pitch after pitch into the night sky, his determination a thunder that seemed to promise protection. But still, the spaces on the bench remained empty, and the emptiness whispered louder than encouragement. The next game revealed the wound most plainly. Springfield's lineup was nearly unrecognizable. More stars than locals now, their polished skill dazzling but somehow distant. The townsfolk cheered all the same, but their voices wavered. They did not come only to see perfection. They had come to see themselves reflected on the field, and now that reflection was vanishing, replaced by something too sharp, too far from their own fumbling humanity. Homer played with a strange heaviness, as though carrying not only his own weight, but the absence of all who had gone before him. He swung with ferocity, sometimes connecting, sometimes missing entirely, but always trying. His effort drew the loudest cheers, for the town recognized in him the last ember of its own spirit on that field, and so Springfield clung to him. He became, without seeking it, a symbol of what remained imperfect, flawed, but present. Each time he stepped to the plate, the crowd leaned forward, hearts bound to his swing. not because they expected greatness, but because they saw themselves in his striving. After the game, he lingered on the field as the stars filed out, their shadows long against the twilight. The legends offered their nods, their quiet encouragement. But Homer felt apart from them, tethered instead to the memory of his vanished friends. He looked around at the empty dugout, the benches where laughter had once spilled, and he whispered softly into the dark, "Come back." The field gave no answer. Only the crickets sang, steady and indifferent, as the night folded itself over the town. The vanishings would continue, though Springfield did not yet know how far they would reach. For now, the people held on as best they could, weaving their hope into Homer's clumsy swings, into every cheer that rose into the cooling air, and somewhere, in the hush between innings, the boy at the window watched, his voice barely a sigh. Remember, even echoes endure. The dugout was almost empty now. A scattering of gloves lay abandoned on the wooden bench, their leather darkened by sweat, their owners absent. The legends still came, sharp and dazzling, but they filled the space differently, more like visiting royalty than hometown kin. They offered Homer nods, advice, and smiles, yet none of it dulled the ache of the hollow dugout. When Homer stood at the plate these days, he felt the silence pressing in, where once Carl or Lenny might have shouted clumsy encouragement, or Barney might have belched from the bench with drunken support. There was only the measured calm of professional stars. Their cheers were practiced, precise, but not personal. They lifted him, yes, but they did not wrap him in the warmth of belonging. The townsfolk sensed it too. Each time Homer approached the batter's box, the crowd rose louder, as though trying to fill the void themselves. Children waved hand-painted signs, mothers clutched their youngest close, fathers leaned forward with folded arms and steady eyes. The people of Springfield no longer looked for victory alone. They looked for themselves, for the stubborn pulse of ordinary courage, and in Homer they found it. He was not graceful, he was not always successful, but he was there, and that, more than any clean swing, mattered most. One evening, as twilight stretched across the field, Homer lingered at home plate long after the others had gone. The chalk lines had smudged beneath so many feet, the bases glowed pale under the stadium lights, and the grass whispered with the night breeze. He gripped the bat loosely, listening to the echoes of the crowd still ringing in his ears. For a moment he closed his eyes and imagined his friends returning, Lenny limping but smiling, Carl still coughing but defiant, Barney stumbling onto the field with a grin that reeked of beer, even Moe muttering about lousy calls while standing ready nonetheless. In his heart, Homer played the game with them again, laughter mixing with clumsy errors, a chorus of imperfection that felt more real than all the Polish in the world. But when he opened his eyes, the field was empty. Only his own shadow stood beside him, long and lonesome. That night, Marge found him awake at the kitchen table again. The bat rested across his lap, as though it had become an extension of him. He stared at it, as one might stare at a photograph, seeking memory in the grain of its wood. Homie?" Marge said softly, her voice a blanket of concern. "You've been so quiet lately." Homer lifted his head slowly. His eyes were tired, rimmed with the wear of too many sleepless nights. "They're gone, Marge, all of them, one by one, and it's just me now. Just me, standing there." Marge set a gentle hand on his shoulder. "And that's enough." The words struck him like a bell, reverberating in his chest. Enough? Could it be? Could one man, clumsy and ordinary, stand as the reflection of an entire town? Could his presence at the plate carry the weight of those who had vanished? He did not know, but her words rooted themselves inside him, steadying his heart. The next game dawned cool and bright, the air crisp with early morning promise. Homer laced his shoes with slow determination, tugged at his cap, and stepped onto the field with a strange stillness. The legends towered around him, their confidence undeniable, yet Homer walked among them without shrinking. He was not their equal, not in skill, not in stature, but he was their constant, the one who remained. When his turn came, the crowd leaned forward as one. The pitcher's shadow stretched long across the mound, his arm coiled like a spring. The ball snapped through the air, fast and fierce. Homer swung and missed. Gasps rose but were quickly swallowed by louder cheers. The people willed him onward, urging him not with demands of perfection, but with love for his trying. Another pitch, another miss. The count deepened. Still, they roared encouragement, the sound a tide that lifted him. On the third pitch, something shifted. Homer closed his eyes just for a breath, hearing not the crowd, not the legends, but the voices of those who had once stood beside him. He heard Lenny's awkward laugh, Carl's steady voice, Barney's half-slurred cheer. Moe's grumble softened into camaraderie. They were not gone, not entirely. Their echoes remained stitched into his heart. He opened his eyes, tightened his grip, and swung. The crack of the bat split the air. The ball arced high, cutting across the sky like a stubborn star refusing to fall. The crowd erupted, their voices shaking the bleachers. Homer ran, legs heavy but determined, pounding each base as though marking the presence of all who had vanished. He reached home plate breathless, stumbling but safe. And when he looked up, he saw them, not in flesh, not in reality, but in the shimmer of memory and longing. His friends, lined along the dugout in the glow of the stadium lights, cheering him as though they had never left. He blinked, and the vision was gone. But its warmth stayed. That night he slept, truly slept, deeply, without the restless turning that had haunted him for weeks. The boy at the window came again, but this time he was smiling. "You see now," the boy whispered, "alone does not mean abandoned. Echoes walk beside you, play for them, and you will never truly stand by yourself." Homer nodded in the dream, his heart lighter than it had been in months. The story of Springfield's team continued, of course. The vanishings had not stopped, the strangeness still hovered. Mr. Burns still pulled threads unseen, yet, from that night on, Homer carried something different when he walked to the plate. Not despair, not fear, but the quiet knowledge that even in solitude, he was never entirely alone. For in the cheers of his town, in the echoes of his vanished friends, and in the simple grip of the bat in his hands, he carried a chorus, and with each swing, the chorus sang. The lights came on slowly one by one, like stars being coaxed into the sky by unseen hands. Their glow shimmered across the grass, turning the field into something more dream than earth. Springfield gathered once more, the town folding itself into the wooden bleachers, their breath rising in a soft mist beneath the cool evening air. This was not just another game. Everyone felt it, though no one could name exactly why. Perhaps it was the hush before the first pitch, or the way the legends themselves seemed quieter than usual, as if even their certainty trembled in the glow of the lamps. Homer sat at the end of the bench, fingers drumming lightly on his knees. The bat lay beside him, familiar and steady. He glanced toward the crowd, and for the first time he noticed how many faces he recognized, not just as neighbors but as chapters of his own life. Mrs. Crabapple leaned forward, cigarette dangling, her eyes softer than her voice had ever been. Groundskeeper Willie sat with a flask hidden poorly in his coat, shouting things that only half made sense. Principal Skinner, stiff as ever, nevertheless clapped when Homer's name was called. They were all here, bound together not by greatness, but by belonging. The other players took their places. The legends shone brightly, sharp reflexes, practiced steps, movements so fluid they almost seemed rehearsed. But Springfield's ragged group, the ones who remained, moved with a different rhythm, halting, earnest, a little awkward, yet their every action carried weight. It was not grace they offered, but grit. The first innings passed slowly like the opening verses of a lullaby. The crowd cheered, but the sound was muted, respectful as if they were afraid to break the fragile balance that hovered over the field. Every swing, every catch, every stumble felt larger than it should have, as though each moment were etched deeper by the night itself. Homer took his turn at the plate. The pitcher wound back, the crowd inhaled, and the ball shot forward like a streak of silver. Homer swung with all his heart. The bat connected, not cleanly, but enough. The ball rolled stubbornly toward first base. Homer lumbered down the line, each step heavy, his breath loud in his ears. He was tagged out just before the bag, but the crowd cheered anyway, louder than if he had hit a home run, for they saw what he carried, the persistence of someone who refused to vanish. Between plays, Homer stood in the field, staring up at the sky. The lights drowned out most of the stars, yet a few remained, stubborn and flickering. He wondered if his vanished friends looked down from somewhere far away, their laughter floating just out of reach. The boy from his dreams had told him that echoes remained. Perhaps the stars themselves were echoes, small fires holding on in the dark. In the dugout, the legends whispered among themselves. Their eyes carried unease, a subtle tremor beneath their polished confidence. Even they felt it now, the sense that the game was not about skill, not about who would score the most runs. It was about Springfield, about the town holding itself together in the face of a mystery that could not be explained. The innings stretched. Time seemed to slow, the air thick with something unnameable. At one point, the crowd fell utterly silent. No crack of bat, no call from the umpire, no murmur conversation, only the hum of the lights overhead, steady and electric. In that silence, Homer felt it again. The weight of the empty spaces, the vanished players, the friends who should have been beside him. Yet he did not feel crushed. Instead, he felt their absence as a kind of presence, a reminder that their memory walked with him. In the seventh inning, with the score balanced on a fragile thread, Homer found himself once more at bat. The stadium seemed to hold its breath. The pitcher's arm coiled, the ball flew, and for a moment everything slowed. Homer saw the ball, not as leather and stitching, but as a piece of time itself, spinning through the air toward him. He swung, and contact rang out, a sound not sharp, not perfect, but honest. The ball rose into the sky, high enough to draw gasps, but not far enough to clear the fence. It fell into a glove before the outfield fence, and the crowd groaned softly. Homer lowered his bat, head bent, but then, something strange. The crowd applauded anyway, rising in waves, their claps echoing across the night. Children shouted his name, adults cupped their hands around their mouths, and for a moment, even the legends joined in, not because of triumph, but because of presence. Homer had given them something greater than victory, himself unbroken, still swinging. The game went on, but its outcome faded into unimportance. Each play, each stumble, each laugh carried more weight than the numbers on the scoreboard. Springfield cheered not for winning, but for standing together beneath the lights, even as the world around them slipped further into strangeness. As the final inning began, the moon lifted itself above the horizon, pale and watchful. Homer stood on the edge of the dugout, cap pulled low, bat in hand. He breathed deeply, the night air cool in his lungs. He felt tired, but it was a good tired, the kind that comes from giving all of oneself, even when the world asks too much. The legends still shone, sharp and powerful. But tonight, Springfield shone too. Not with polish, not with certainty, but with something deeper, resilience. When the last out was called, the crowd did not rush to leave. They lingered, as if afraid the magic of the night would dissolve once they stepped away. Homer stood at home plate, alone once more, and looked out at them. He did not speak, but he lifted his bat gently, as if to say, "We're still here. We're still us." The lights hummed overhead. The stars blinked faintly beyond them. and in the quiet space between, Springfield breathed together, bound not by victory, but by memory, love, and the strange, glowing courage of simply showing up. That night, as Homer drifted into sleep, the boy returned in his dream. "You see now," the boy said softly, sitting at the edge of the field, "it isn't about the score. It never was. It's about the light that shines when people stand together, and even when some vanish, the light remains." Homer nodded, eyes half closed. The boy's figure shimmered in the dream, and for the first time Homer felt no fear of waking. The boy whispered, "Rest now. The game beneath the lights will always glow, even in memory, and tomorrow you will swing again." And so Homer slept, the rhythm of the game echoing softly in his chest, like the beat of a lullaby that promised he was never alone. The days that followed blurred together, like ink spreading slowly across paper. Springfield went on with its rhythms, children hurrying to school, Mr. Burns tightening his grip on shadows, the taverns filling with murmured gossip, yet all of it seemed thinner, less solid, as if the edges of reality itself were fraying. More players had vanished. Sometimes it happened on the field. One moment a man stood at second base, the next his glove lay empty in the dirt. Other times they simply failed to appear, their uniforms left behind like forgotten skins. At first the town gasped, panicked, searched every corner, but as the vanishing spread, a quiet acceptance crept in. People began to speak of it less, as though naming it would only invite more loss. Homer felt it most keenly. Each time he stepped into the dugout, the bench seemed longer, the space beside him wider. The legends still filled the gaps, moving with practiced ease, but their presence could not mask the growing emptiness. He caught himself glancing sideways during games, expecting to see Lenny's crooked smile, or Carl's patient nod, or Barney's sloppy grin. Each absence pressed against him like a bruise, yet the games continued, always under the lights now, as if daylight itself had retreated. The glow hummed overhead, steady but unnatural, bathing the field in a perpetual twilight. Sometimes Homer wondered if the lights were the only thing holding the world in place. One evening, after another narrow game, Homer lingered on the field. The crowd had gone, their cheers fading into the night, leaving only the whisper of wind through the bleachers. He walked slowly to the pitcher's mound, bent down, and scooped a handful of dirt into his palm. It felt cool, ordinary, grounding. He closed his fist around it and whispered, almost to himself, "Don't leave, not you too." Behind him a voice stirred. It was soft, almost hesitant. "Talking to the earth now, Homer." Homer turned. It was Lisa, standing at the edge of the grass, her small frame bathed in the light. She clutched her notebook against her chest. "Maybe I am," Homer admitted, his voice tired. Lisa walked closer, her eyes searching his face. "It's scary," she said simply. "Everyone disappearing. The rules don't feel like they hold anymore." Homer nodded. He didn't have the words for it, but she had spoken the truth. It felt as if some invisible thread, the one that tied Springfield to the world, was unraveling. "But you're still here," Lisa whispered, "and that matters. You're an anchor. Even if you don't know it." Her words settled over him like a blanket, warm and fragile. An anchor. He thought of his clumsy swings, his heavy steps, his imperfect presence at the plate. Could such ordinariness hold anything together? And yet, hadn't it already? The crowd still came. The lights still hummed. The game still played. Perhaps the fragile persistence of one ordinary man was enough to keep the story from dissolving. That night, the dream returned. The boy sat cross-legged at the base of the bleachers, his face half lit by starlight. His eyes were ancient, though his body was young. "It is thinning," the boy said softly, not as a warning, but as a simple truth. "The line between what is remembered and what is lost. Soon you may not know which side you stand on." Homer sat beside him, his dream body heavy with weariness. Will I vanish too? The boy tilted his head, thoughtful. Maybe, maybe not. But even if you do, something will melon. The sound of your swing, the way your town cheered, the way you carried the weight of absence without letting it crush you, echoes Homer. You've already become one. Homer closed his eyes. In the distance he could hear the faint crack of a bat, the steady hum of the lights, the murmur of voices that might have been his vanished friends. It was all blurred together, indistinguishable from the rhythm of his own heart. The dream dissolved, and dawn crept faintly across Springfield, yet even in daylight, the field remained under the glow of the lamps. The sun seemed hesitant, pale, and washed, as though it no longer had rand to pierce through. At breakfast, Bart slumped over his cereal, his eyes unusually quiet. "Dad," he muttered, "what if one day it's me? What if I just go?" Homer froze the spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at his son, at the boy's restless energy dimmed by fear. Slowly, Homer reached across the table and squeezed Bart's hand. "Then I'll remember you," he said simply, "and that means you'll never really be gone." Bart didn't answer, but the faintest smile tugged at his lips before he bent back to his cereal. Later that evening, the game resumed. The stands were full again, though no one spoke about why they kept coming. They simply arrived, drawn as if by instinct, knowing that something larger than sport unfolded here. When Homer stepped onto the field, he felt it stronger than ever, the thinness, the shimmering veil between what was and what wasn't. The bases glowed faintly, not from chalk but from memory. The outfield shimmered as if painted by fading dream. Even the legends seemed unsettled, their movements less sure, their eyes darting toward the shadows that lapped at the edges of the field. And then it happened. In the middle of the game, just as the ball cracked from a bat, two more players vanished. Not in smoke, not in sound, but in silence. As if the world had simply exhaled them away. Their gloves hit the grass, their caps rolled gently to the dirt, the crowd gasped, then fell silent, hearts pounding in the shared recognition that the vanishings had reached a new rhythm. Homer stood still, gripping his bat tightly. His chest rose and fell, but he did not crumble. Instead, he whispered to himself, barely audible, "I'm still here, I'm still here." And the crowd, though they could not hear him, seemed to echo it. Murmurs rippled through the stands. "We're still here! We're still here!" The game staggered on, but it no longer felt like a contest. It felt like a ritual, a holding together of threads. Each swing, each catch, each cheer was an act of defiance against the dissolving edge of the world. When the final out was called, Homer did not celebrate or mourn. He simply stood at home plate, looking out at the crowd, at his family, at the empty spaces where players had been. The lights hummed overhead, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw all of Springfield past and present, vanished and remaining, gathered together in the glow. The vision flickered, then was gone. Homer lowered his bat and walked slowly back to the dugout. The boy's words lingered in his mind, echoes. "You've already become one." And in his heart, Homer wondered if the world itself was vanishing. Could echoes be enough to keep it alive? The bleachers groaned softly that night as Springfield gathered once again. It felt less like a crowd and more like a congregation, a town returning to the same place over and over, as if drawn by a ritual they could not name. The lights flickered on, spilling their pale glow across the diamond, and for a moment the field looked suspended in the void, floating on its own island of grass and chalk. Families arrived together, yet sat with a curious quiet. Children held their parents' hands more tightly. Elderly neighbors leaned on one another, gazing not at the scoreboard but at the people around them, as if confirming that they were still there. Even the laughter, when it came, was softer than it had once been, like a song hummed under the breath. Homer noticed it immediately. As he warmed up on the sideline, swinging his bat in heavy arcs, He felt the stares from the stands, not the ordinary stares of fans hoping for a hit or cheering for a run, but something deeper. The eyes of Springfield seemed to plead with him. Be present, be steady, be here. He was not sure he could carry it, yet each swing of the bat, each breath he took, seemed to reassure them somehow. When the game began, the air carried an odd echo. Every cheer seemed to return twice, faint and delayed, as if the bleachers themselves had found a voice. A child called out for her father on the field, and the sound repeated softly like a whisper in a tunnel. People shifted uneasily, yet no one left. As the innings stretched on, the echoes deepened. Chants for Springfield rang out, but Homer heard them again a moment later, hollow and faint, as though shouted by ghosts in the rafters. He looked to the crowd and saw faces he recognized. Then, for a split second, faces he knew could not be there. Friends long gone. Players who had vanished. Even Maud Flanders, her gentle smile visible for the blink of an eye before dissolving into the blur of strangers. He rubbed his eyes, but the stands shimmered again. Were they hallucinations, memories, or had the vanishings found a way to return, not in flesh, but in echo? Homer's heart ached with longing, yet he steadied himself. He had learned by now that to collapse into fear was to invite it closer. The legends noticed it too. They exchanged wary glances, their confidence fraying at the edges. For all their strength, they did not understand this place. They had come to play a game, but Springfield was something else entirely, a slow, patient act of remembrance. In the third inning, Homer stepped to the plate. The crowd rose, their voices soft but insistent. Homer, Homer, the chant rolled out, warm and steady. But when the bat met the ball, a sharp crack that echoed like thunder. The chant did not fade, it multiplied. The bleachers reverberated with hundreds of voices, some high, some low, some so old they creaked with age. Homer! Homer! He froze mid-run, staring at the crowd, his breath caught in his chest. Among the chanting faces he swore he saw Lenny, standing and waving his arms, Carl smiling with steady calm, Barney clapping wildly, his cheeks flushed with drink, even Moe grimacing as though reluctant to cheer, yet doing so anyway. And then, like mist in wind, they were gone. Only ordinary Springfielders remained, clapping and shouting with ordinary voices. Homer finished his run to first base, his legs heavy, his eyes wet. By the seventh inning, the echoes had grown almost unbearable. The crowd cheered, and Homer heard the vanished cheer too, voices that did not belong to the living, yet belonged to Springfield all the same. The players shifted uneasily, but none left the field, for even in unease no one wanted to miss what was unfolding. At one point, Lisa rose from the stands, notebook in hand, her small figure silhouetted by the lights. "Dad," she called, her voice strong. "Keep swinging." The sound repeated itself seconds later, thinner, stranger. "Dad, keep swinging." Homer felt his chest tighten. He nodded slowly toward her, bat raised in quiet acknowledgement. She sat down again, scribbling furiously, as though trying to capture what no one else dared name. When the final inning came, the atmosphere was thick, dreamlike. The ball floated slower than usual. The players moved with the weight of memory pressing against them. The score had become irrelevant. All that mattered was the gathering, the echoes, the fragile thread of connection holding Springfield together. Homer's final at-bat was not spectacular. He swung, missed, swung again, and missed once more. On the last pitch, he connected. The ball skittered toward third base, an easy out, yet the crowd erupted louder than ever before, voices multiplying until it sounded as though the entire history of Springfield itself cheered in unison. The bleachers seemed to shake, their wooden beams groaning under the weight of sound. But in that moment, Homer did not see the players around him. He did not see the pitcher or the bases or the field. He saw the stands, filled not just with the living, but with everyone Springfield had ever lost, the vanished teammates, the forgotten neighbors, the generations who had worked, laughed, and faded into memory. All of them, together, for the span of a heartbeat, lending their voices. The vision broke when the umpire's voice cut the night. Out, the crowd stilled, the echo fell silent, and the world seemed to fold back into itself. Yet, Homer stood straighter than before, for he knew now that echoes were not emptiness. They were presence of another kind, a reminder that nothing, not even vanishing, could erase the bonds of memory. After the game, as the stands emptied, he lingered by home plate. The grass shivered in the night breeze, the dirt cool beneath his shoes. He whispered, "I heard you, all of you." His voice trembled, but it carried, and perhaps, just perhaps, the faintest echo whispered back. That night, Homer dreamed again. The boy was there, seated in the stands this time, his small hands folded in his lap. "You saw them," the boy said gently. Homer nodded, eyes heavy with tears. "I saw everyone." The boy smiled faintly, though his eyes carried the weight of centuries. Echoes are not the end. They are what remains when the world decides to hold on a little longer. Springfield holds on, and so do you. Homer leaned back in the dream, the sound of cheering still faint in his ears. He drifted towards sleep within sleep, a deeper layer of rest where words no longer mattered. Only the echoes remained, soft and steady, like the chorus of a lullaby that would never truly fade. The night after the echoing game, Springfield did not stir as it usually did. The taverns were quiet, the streets oddly hushed, even the neon signs flickered more slowly, as though the town itself had fallen into a deeper rhythm of rest. People spoke in whispers, not because they feared being overheard, but because they did not wish to disturb something fragile that lingered in the air. In his bed, Homer lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The sound of echoes had not left his ears. Even in silence, he felt them, a second voice that trailed every thought, every heartbeat. It was not haunting, not entirely. If anything, it was consoling, a reminder that absence could still leave presence behind. He closed his eyes, and the field returned to him, the stands filled with faces, the sound of voices he had thought lost forever. He turned over and whispered, "Good night, everyone," and for a moment he swore the whisper came back to him. The next morning he walked the quiet streets. Marge joined him, her hand folded gently into his, the kind of touch that said, "I am here, no matter what storms come." They did not speak much. They did not need to. At the edge of town, the ball field lay empty under a pale sun. The bleachers creaked softly in the wind, their wood carrying the weight of 1,000 cheers. Homer paused at the gate, unsure whether to step inside. But then, with Marge's hand in his, he entered. The diamond was still marked, though faintly, the chalk lines fading like memories that resist erasure. He walked to home plate and stood there, silent. In his chest, the echoes stirred again. They did jout this time. They hummed, a low resonance, like a lullaby hummed by an unseen parent. It was neither victory nor defeat, neither demand nor warning. It was simply farewell. Lisa arrived shortly after, notebook pressed to her chest. She had written late into the night, documenting every detail she could recall. The sound of the chants, the shimmer of the faces, the way the crowd had become more than itself. She had questions, scientific, philosophical, spiritual. Yet when she stepped onto the field, she said nothing. She only stood near her father, her head bowed slightly, as though she too sensed the goodbye. Bart came too, his usual swagger subdued. He carried a bat under his arm, dragging it gently along the grass as if unsure whether it was still meant for play. He looked at Homer, then at the empty stands, and muttered, "Kinda feels like everyone's still here, huh?" Homer nodded, his eyes damp. "Yeah, boy, they're here." No one asked who they were. Everyone already knew. The family stood together on the field, For a long while they said nothing. They listened to the wind, to the creaking wood, to the faintest suggestion of voices that might or might not have been there. The moment stretched on, tender and fragile. Finally, Homer raised his cap, holding it against his chest. "Thanks," he whispered into the air. "For the games, for the laughs, for everything." His voice cracked on the last word, but he did not hide it. Bart lowered his bat, pressing it into the dirt like a flag planted at the end of a journey. Lisa placed her notebook gently on the mound. Marge simply closed her eyes, letting the breeze carry her silent prayer. The field seemed to breathe in reply. The air thickened, shimmered, and for an instant the bleachers were not empty. They were filled again, just as they had been in the dreamlike game. Oasis smiled, clapped, waved. The sound of cheering rose, not deafening, but warm, the kind of cheer given at the end of a story well told. Then, slowly, the image faded. The bleachers emptied, the sound softened, the echoes dissolved into quiet. It was not a cruel vanishing this time. It was gentle, like smoke dispersing into air, like a candle burning low until only a wisp of warmth remained. It was a goodbye, offered softly, without fear. Homer lowered his cap, wiping his eyes. He exhaled deeply, the weight in his chest loosening. "They're gone," he said. Lisa touched his arm. "No, Dad, they're just quieter now." Marge squeezed his hand. "And quiet doesn't mean gone." The family left the field together, walking slowly back toward town. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the grass. Each step felt like closing a chapter, turning a page that could never be returned to, yet would always remain part of the book. That evening Springfield gathered once more, not at the stadium but in the town square. No one had called for a meeting, no one had organized a speech. They simply arrived, drawn by the same silent instinct. People lit candles, their flames flickering in the twilight. Stories were shared, voices low and steady, as neighbors remembered those who had vanished and those who had returned in echo. Laughter mixed with tears, the sound carrying like a hymn through the streets. Homer stood among them, Marge by his side, the children close at hand. He felt smaller than he ever had, yet more whole, for he understood now that Springfield's strength was not in its players, nor in its games, but in its ability to hold memory together, even when the world itself seemed to unravel. As the candles burned low, Homer raised his voice one last time. "Good night, Springfield," he said softly. And somewhere deep in the folds of silence, a faint whisper answered, "Good night, Homer." The family walked home under the glow of stars, their shadows long and unbroken. The echoes did not return that night, nor the next, but they no longer needed to. The soft goodbye had been spoken. The rest was memory, and memory was enough. The nights that followed became gentler. Springfield, for all its noise and mischief, found itself moving at a slower rhythm. People lingered longer at their doorsteps before going inside, as though savoring the silence. Children, who had once shouted across the streets, now spoke more softly, sometimes pointing to the sky as if expecting to see the faint glow of a crowd above the clouds. The town had been brushed by something larger than itself, and like dusting a delicate relic, no one wished to disturb the impression it had left. For Homer, each morning began with a small ritual. He would rise before the rest of the house stirred, shuffle to the backyard with his cup of coffee, and sit beneath the maple tree. He did not rush. He would simply sit, sip, and listen. The echoes had gone, yet the habit of waiting for them remained. It was as though silence itself had become a companion, one that required patience to understand. Sometimes he caught himself nodding at nothing in particular, as though responding to a voice only he could hear, and in a way, he was. Marge watched him with quiet admiration. She did not press him with questions, nor did she demand explanations. She understood that some experiences could not be spoken plainly. They had to be carried, gently, like a folded letter in the pocket. Every so often, she would join him, her hand finding his, and together they would sit in wordless comfort. It was not about solving mysteries anymore. It was about allowing them to linger. Lisa continued her writing, filling notebook after notebook. She no longer tried to dissect what had happened into equations or theories. Instead, she wrote as if preserving a dream before it slipped away. Her words carried a tone of reverence, a recognition that some truths were best left unpinned, free to float in the mind like lanterns on water. When she read passages aloud to her family, her voice softened, and even Bart listened, uncharacteristically quiet, his usual smirk replaced with something closer to wonder. Bart, though, found his own way of keeping the memory alive. He painted symbols on the walls of his treehouse, not words, not exact faces, but shapes that suggested the swirl of sound, the rise of voices, the shimmer of a crowd that existed somewhere between presence and absence. When friends asked what they meant, he only shrugged and said, "It's like when you laugh so hard you don't even need to remember the joke." His friends didn't quite get it, but they nodded anyway, because somehow the explanation felt enough. Springfield as a whole carried the memory differently. The tavern had a new hush between rounds of laughter. Mo kept an empty stool at the bar, joking that it was reserved for a regular who still drops in now and then. At the school, teachers spoke more gently when recalling history, as if reminding the children that stories were more than facts. They were bridges between the living and the remembered. Even at the nuclear plant, workers found themselves pausing at the hum of the machines, imagining it as another kind of echo, a reminder that sound itself had layers. And so the weeks passed. The event did not vanish. It simply softened, settling into the folds of daily life like a lullaby hummed long after the singer has fallen asleep. Homer, in his own way, grew older through it. He laughed as he always had. He stumbled as he always did. But beneath it all, there was a new patience, a gentleness that surprised even him. Sometimes he found himself forgiving things more quickly. A spilled drink, a harsh word, a mistake at work. "It's okay," he would say, more often than before. And though he rarely explained why, the truth was simple. When one has heard voices return from silence, every little error seems less heavy. One night, long after the children had gone to bed, Homer and Marge sat on the porch. The air was cool, the sky scattered with stars that blinked like old lanterns in the distance. Homer leaned back, sighing. "You ever think," he murmured, "that maybe all of life is just cheering from the stands? That maybe we're all voices for someone else's game?" Marge tilted her head, smiling softly. "Maybe, or maybe the cheering is what keeps the game alive." He considered that, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I like that." Silence settled again, but it was a kind silence, the kind that wrapped around them like a blanket. Above, the stars seemed to hum, faintly as if agreeing. In time, Lisa's notebooks filled entire shelves. Bart's painted symbols faded with weather, but their outlines remained. Marge's garden grew in quiet resilience. And Homer's early mornings beneath the maple tree became his greatest comfort. The echoes had ended, yes, but what remained was not absence, it was legacy. It was the realization that memory itself was a form of presence, and that love, in all its ordinary gestures, was the truest kind of cheer. On one particular morning, as Homer sat beneath the tree, the air stirred, a single leaf fluttered down, landing in his lap. He picked it up, held it for a moment, and smiled. "I hear you," he whispered, and for a heartbeat he thought he heard a whisper back. "We hear you too." He closed his eyes, letting the sun warm his face. No fear, no sorrow, just peace. And with that, Springfield carried on, not forgetting, not clinging, but holding gently. The crowd was gone, yet the love remained, echoing softly, endlessly, through every corner of the town, through every heart that remembered to listen. And somewhere, perhaps beyond the veil of clouds, the stadium still roared, not loud, not urgent, but steady, patient, and eternal. The town had returned to its familiar rhythm, yet something invisible lingered in Springfield's air, a softness, a patience, a way of walking a little slower, as though no one wished to disturb the gentle hush that remained after the echoes faded. In this new quiet, people discovered small comforts that had always been there but never fully seen. The lamplight on the corner glowed warmer, as if aware of its own duty to guard the night. The clock tower no longer seemed impatient, its hands moving with the calm steadiness of breath. Even the restless buzz of the nuclear plant softened, more like the purr of a cat than the growl of machinery. For Homer, life became quieter in ways he could not have predicted. He still loved his naps on the couch, his late-night snacks, his clumsy adventures, but woven into all of it was a deeper stillness. He would sometimes pause at the window while others bustled behind him, gaze outward and murmur something almost inaudible. Marge would catch the shape of his lips, and though the words were too soft to hear, she knew their meaning. Thank you. It was gratitude not to any one person, but to the unseen chorus that had filled the stands of his heart. Gratitude to memory itself. Gratitude to the fact that voices could linger even after they had left. Lisa grew into her writing with greater ease. She began to read sections aloud, not for answers but as lullabies. Her notebooks carried the hum of echoes, her words a translation of silence into ink. Bart, though he hears her, sometimes, often found himself sneaking back to listen, his smirk half hidden. Even he had come to understand that the story they lived through was not one of rules or victories, but of tenderness. Marge's garden blossomed in unexpected ways. Flowers grew taller, vines wove into heart-like shapes, and in the evenings she swore she could hear a low chorus in the leaves when the wind passed through. She never told the others directly, but she hummed along with it as she watered the soil. It was her private duet with the memory of the crowd. The people of Springfield carried it too. Mo kept the empty stool. The schoolchildren whispered softer. Old men at the barber shop paused before finishing their jokes, as if waiting for unseen laughter to arrive and end them, and when it did, when someone chuckled at just the right moment, the pause always felt like part of the story. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in lavender and blue, Homer gathered his family in the living room. He did not have a speech prepared. He rarely did. He simply looked at them. Marge's patient eyes, Lisa's curious light, Bart's restless spark, Maggie's quiet presence, and said, "We're all still here. That's the best part. We're all still here." The room grew quiet. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, steady and low, almost like the faintest echo of a stadium crowd breathing together. Marge smiled, brushing Homer's hand with hers. Lisa leaned against his shoulder. Bart rolled his eyes but stayed close. Maggie let out a soft coo, as if agreeing. The moment passed without ceremony, but it left a mark like a footprint pressed gently into soft earth. Later that night, Homer stepped out once more beneath the maple tree. The stars above were steady and clear, scattered across the sky like lanterns floating on a still lake. He tipped his head back, took a deep breath, and let it out slowly. "Good night," he whispered again. For a moment, only silence. And then, perhaps only in his mind, perhaps in the folds of the night itself, the air seemed to whisper back, "Good night, Homer." He smiled, eyes heavy with sleep. He closed them there beneath the stars, his breath even, his body resting into the chair. The echoes no longer startled him, no longer carried the sharpness of mystery. They were soft now, like a lullaby wrapping itself around him. And Springfield slept too. The whole town, drifting together into dream. The stadium was gone, the crowd was gone, the cheers were gone, and yet not gone. For they lived in memory, in ritual, in story. They lived in the way children whispered on their walk home, in the way Marge hummed in her garden, in the way Lisa filled her notebooks, in the way Bart painted his symbols, and in the way Homer, half asleep beneath his maple, tilted his head as if still listening. Not everything needs to last forever. Some things only need to linger long enough to change the way we breathe. And with that, the tale finds its rest. The story does not end with thunder or triumph, but with the soft hush of a crowd taking its seats in the theater of memory. Springfield carries on, the echoes carry on, and you, listening here, carry it too, a reminder that presence and absence are not opposites, but companions. So let the night carry you now, let your own breath be the crowd, let your heart be the field, and when dreams come, may they come like echoes, gentle, familiar, and kind. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.